The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Tombstone Creek, Arizona, where a crowd had gathered around the makeshift gallows that had been hastily erected in the town square. Cattle rancher Jacob "Jake" Harrison had ridden into town for supplies, but the grim spectacle before him made his blood run cold. Standing on the platform with a noose around his neck was a boy who couldn't have been more than 14 years old. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and dust, but it was the look of terrified innocence in his green eyes that hit Jake like a physical blow. "Please," the boy cried out to the hostile crowd below. "I didn't steal nothing. I was just hungry and looking for work." But the crowd was in no mood for mercy. They had been whipped into a frenzy by the accusations of the town's most powerful citizen, and they wanted blood to satisfy their sense of justice. "String him up," someone shouted from the crowd. "Thieving orphans are nothing but trouble." "Make an example of him," called another voice. "Show these drifters what happens when they steal from honest folks." Jake pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim with determination. At 55, he had seen enough injustice in his life to recognize it when it stared him in the face. This wasn't justice, it was a lynching, and everything in his moral fiber rebelled against what he was witnessing. "Hold on there," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who was used to being heard. "What's this boy accused of?" The crowd turned to look at him, and Jake recognized several faces, including Mayor Caldwell and the town's self-appointed judge, Harrison Blake, a man with a reputation for harsh sentences and quick trials. "Jake Harrison," Mayor Caldwell said with surprise, "didn't expect to see you in town today. This boy here is accused of stealing $50 from Cornelius Whitmore's safe." Jake's eyes hardened at the mention of Whitmore's name. Cornelius Whitmore was the richest man in 3 counties, a railroad baron who had built his fortune through ruthless business practices and political corruption. He was also known for his hatred of anyone he considered beneath his social station. $50 is a serious charge, Jake said carefully, "but this is just a boy. What evidence do you have?" Judge Blake, a thin man with cruel eyes, stepped forward with obvious irritation. "Mr. Harrison, this is a legal proceeding. The boy was caught red-handed with Whitmore's money in his possession." "I found it," the boy cried out desperately. "I found the money in an alley behind the hotel. I was going to turn it in to the sheriff, but Mr. Whitmore saw me with it and started yelling that I stole it." "Convenient story," Blake sneered. "What's your name?" "Boy Timothy Walsh, sir," the boy replied, his voice shaking with fear. "I'm from back east. Been traveling west looking for work since my folks died of fever." Jake studied the boy's face, seeing the honesty and desperation there. Timothy Walsh looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a frightened, hungry orphan who had stumbled into a situation far beyond his understanding. "Judge Blake," Jake said firmly, "where's Sheriff Morrison? Shouldn't he be handling this matter?" "Sheriff's out of town chasing rustlers," Blake replied curtly. "As acting magistrate, I have full authority to dispense justice in his absence." Jake knew that Blake had appointed himself to this position, taking advantage of the sheriff's absence to settle some old scores and curry favor with powerful men like Whitmore. "And you've decided that justice means hanging a 14-year-old boy without a proper trial?" "The evidence is clear," Blake insisted. "The boy had stolen money in his possession. Under territorial law, theft of more than $25 is a hanging offense. But did he steal it?" Jake pressed. "Or did he find it like he claims?" Cornelius Whitmore himself pushed through the crowd, his expensive clothes and well-fed appearance contrasting sharply with Timothy's ragged condition. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but this matter doesn't concern you. That boy stole from me, and he needs to pay the price." Jake looked between Whitmore's arrogant face and Timothy's terrified one, seeing a stark contrast between wealth and power on one side and innocence and vulnerability on the other. "Mr. Whitmore," Jake said carefully, "how exactly did $50 come to be in an alley behind the hotel?" Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "That's none of your business. The boy stole it from my safe, and that's all that matters." "Actually," Jake replied, "if you're going to hang a child based on your accusation, I think the details matter a great deal." Judge Blake was growing impatient with Jake's interference. "Mr. Harrison, this trial is concluded. The sentence will be carried out at sunset as planned." Jake looked up at Timothy, seeing the boy's green eyes wide with terror as he faced the prospect of death for a crime he insisted he didn't commit. The sun was already beginning to sink toward the western horizon, and sunset was less than 2 hours away. "Timothy," Jake called up to the boy, "tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." Timothy's voice was hoarse from crying, but he spoke clearly. "I've been in town 3 days, sir, looking for work. Nobody would hire me because I'm just a kid with no references. This morning I was real hungry, so I was looking through trash behind the hotel for something to eat. And that's when you found the money." "Yes, sir, it was in a leather pouch, just lying there in the dirt like someone dropped it. I picked it up and was heading to the sheriff's office to turn it in when Mr. Whitmore saw me with it." "Lies," Whitmore shouted. "He broke into my office and stole it from my safe." Jake studied Whitmore's face, noting the beads of sweat on the man's forehead despite the cool afternoon air. "Mr. Whitmore, if the boy broke into your office, surely there would be signs of forced entry." There were signs," Whitmore said weakly. "What kind of signs?" "Broken window, jimmied lock, that sort of thing." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "And I'm sure you've preserved this evidence for the sheriff to examine when he returns?" Whitmore's hesitation was answer enough. "Well, no, I had the damage repaired immediately. Couldn't leave my office unsecured." Several people in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, clearly beginning to doubt Whitmore's story. Jake pressed his advantage. "Timothy," he called up to the Gallows, "you said you found the money behind the hotel. Was anyone else around who might have seen you find it?" Timothy's face brightened with hope. "Yes, sir. There was a lady, one of the hotel workers. She saw me pick up the pouch. Said something about people dropping things all the time back there." Jake turned to the crowd. "Did anyone bother to question this witness before deciding to hang this boy?" The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Judge Blake was clearly growing desperate to proceed with the execution before more questions could be raised. "Enough delays," Blake shouted. "The sun is setting, and justice must be served." But Jake wasn't finished. "One more question. Mr. Whitmore, you said the boy stole $50 from your safe. Can you describe the exact denominations of the bills?" Whitmore's face went pale. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. If it was your money, you should know whether it was in 5s, 10s, 20s. What exactly was stolen?" The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something important was happening. Whitmore looked around desperately, clearly trapped by a question he couldn't answer. I don't recall the exact denominations, Timothy," Jake called up to the boy. "What denominations were in the pouch you found?" "5 $10 bills, sir," Timothy replied immediately. "All crisp and new, like they came straight from the bank." Jake smiled grimly. "Interesting. Mr. Whitmore, didn't you just deposit your railroad payroll at the bank yesterday?" "Payroll? That was paid in new $10 bills?" Several people in the crowd gasped as they began to understand what Jake was suggesting. Whitmore had lost or dropped his money behind the hotel, then accused an innocent boy of theft rather than admit his carelessness. "This is preposterous." Whitmore sputtered. "You're all taking the word of a thieving orphan over a respected businessman. I'm taking the word of someone whose story makes sense over someone whose story has more holes than a moth-eaten blanket," Jake replied firmly. Judge Blake realized that the crowd was turning against the execution. Regardless of these irregularities, the boy was found with money that didn't belong to him. "That's still theft under the law." "No," Jake said firmly, climbing up onto the platform. "That's finding lost property and attempting to return it to the proper authorities, which is exactly what an honest person should do." Jake reached for the noose around Timothy's neck, but Blake drew his gun. "Step away from the prisoner, Harrison, or what?" Jake asked calmly, his own hand moving toward his weapon. "You'll shoot me for preventing the murder of an innocent child." The standoff lasted for several tense seconds before a new voice cut through the tension. "Nobody's shooting anybody." Sheriff Morrison had returned to town just in time, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison was known as an honest lawman who followed proper procedures and didn't cut out a powerful man like Whitmore. "Sheriff," Timothy cried out with relief. "Thank God you're here." Morrison quickly assessed the situation, his experienced eyes taking in the boy on the gallows, the angry crowd, and the obvious tension between Jake and Judge Blake. "Blake," Morrison said firmly, "step away from that boy and explain to me what's going on here. Subscribe to our channel to see what happens next. Will Sheriff Morrison's rival save Timothy from an unjust execution? What secrets about Whitmore's lost money will come to light? Don't miss the explosive next chapter where truth battles corruption and one man's courage saves an innocent life." Sheriff Morrison's weathered face showed barely controlled anger as Judge Blake reluctantly explained the circumstances that had led to Timothy Walsh being fitted with a noose. The more Morrison heard, the darker his expression became. "Let me get this straight," Morrison said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "You decided to hang a 14-year-old boy based solely on Cornelius Whitmore's accusation, without conducting any investigation or waiting for my return?" Judge Blake shifted uncomfortably under the sheriff's steely gaze. "The evidence was clear, Sheriff. The boy was caught with stolen money that he claims to have found behind the hotel." Morrison corrected. "Did you bother to examine the ALLEGED crime scene? Did you question any witnesses? Did you follow any of the basic procedures of law enforcement?" "There wasn't time," Blake said weakly. Whitmore was demanding immediate justice. Morrison's hand moved to his gun belt as he approached the gallows. "Jake, cut that boy down. Now." Jake didn't hesitate. He pulled out his knife and cut the rope around Timothy's neck, catching the boy as he collapsed with relief and exhaustion. Timothy's legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand, but he managed to whisper a heartfelt thank you to both Jake and the sheriff. Timothy Walsh, Morrison said gently, "You're under my protection now. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm around." Cornelius Whitmore pushed forward, his face red with indignation. "Sheriff Morrison, that boy is a thief. I demand justice." "You'll get justice, Whitmore," Morrison replied coldly, "but it'll be real justice, not this lynch mob nonsense. Now, I want to hear your story again, and this time I want details." As Whitmore repeated his accusations, Morrison took careful notes, asking pointed questions that revealed numerous inconsistencies in the railroad baron's story. Meanwhile, Jake helped Timothy down from the platform and gave him water from his canteen. "Easy there, son," Jake said gently as Timothy drank gratefully. "You're safe now." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Timothy whispered, his voice still hoarse from fear. "I thought I was going to die." "Not on my watch," Jake replied firmly. "And it's just Jake. I've got a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of each other, Sheriff." Morrison finished questioning Whitmore and turned his attention to Timothy. His approach was gentle but thorough, and Timothy's story remained consistent under careful examination. "Son," Morrison said when Timothy finished his account, "I want you to show me exactly where you found that money pouch." The small group moved to the alley behind the hotel, where Timothy pointed to a spot near some trash barrels. Morrison examined the area carefully, noting the footprints and other evidence that Blake had ignored in his rush to judgment. "Interesting," Morrison said, kneeling down to examine some scuff marks in the dirt. "These tracks tell a story, and it's not the one Whitmore's been telling." "What do you see?" Jake asked, kneeling beside the sheriff. "Boot prints from expensive shoes. The kind Whitmore wears," Morrison replied, "and they show someone stumbling, maybe dropping something. The tracks lead from the back door of the hotel to this spot, then back toward the main street." Timothy nodded eagerly. "That's exactly where I found the pouch, Sheriff. Right by those trash barrels." Morrison stood up and dusted off his knees. "Whitmore, I think it's time you told us the truth about how your money ended up in this alley." Whitmore's confident demeanor was beginning to crack under the pressure of the investigation. "I've told you the truth. That boy stole my money." "No," Morrison said firmly. "You've told me a story with more holes than a sieve. Let me tell you what I think really happened." The sheriff turned to address the crowd that had followed them to the alley. "I think Mr. Whitmore was at the hotel last night. Probably drinking and gambling in the back room that everyone knows about, but nobody talks about. I think he lost more money than he wanted to admit, and when he left, he was drunk enough to drop his money pouch without realizing it. Whitmore's face had gone white, but he continued to protest. That's speculation. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can, said a new voice from the back of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a middle-aged woman in a hotel uniform approaching the group. Jake recognized her as Mary Sullivan, the hotel's head housekeeper, a woman known for her honesty and attention to detail. Mrs. Sullivan, Sheriff Morrison said with interest. Did you witness something relevant to this matter? Yes, Sheriff, Mary replied firmly. I was working late last night, cleaning the rooms, when I heard a commotion from the back room. Mr. Whitmore was in there with some other men, playing cards and drinking heavily. Whitmore tried to interrupt, but Morrison silenced him with a look. Go on, Mrs. Sullivan. The sheriff encouraged. Well, round midnight, Mr. Whitmore came stumbling out, clearly intoxicated. He was cursing and muttering about losing money, and he was so unsteady on his feet that he bumped into the wall several times. As he made his way to the back door, did you see him drop anything? Morrison asked. Not directly, Mary admitted. But this morning when I was taking out the trash, I saw this young man. She gestured toward Timothy, pick up something from the ground. When he saw me, he asked if I knew who might have dropped it. I told him he should take it to the sheriff's office. Timothy's face lit up with relief. That's exactly what happened, Mrs. Sullivan. Tell them I was trying to do the right thing. Mary Sullivan looked at Timothy with maternal kindness. This boy was clearly trying to return lost property to its rightful owner. Anyone with eyes could see he's honest. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, clearly swaying in Timothy's favor as the truth became apparent. Whitmore realized that his story was falling apart and made one last desperate attempt to maintain his accusation. Even if I did drop the money, Whitmore said desperately, the boy should have returned it to me directly. Taking it to the sheriff's office was just a cover for his theft. Jake stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. Whitmore, you're talking about a 14-year-old orphan who's been in town for 3 days and probably doesn't know you. From Adam, how was he supposed to know the money was yours? Sheriff Morrison nodded in agreement. Furthermore, taking found property to the proper authorities is exactly what the law requires. This boy did everything right. Judge Blake, seeing his authority undermined and his judgment exposed as flawed, tried to reassert control. This is all very touching, but the fact remains that someone needs to be held accountable for the disruption to our community. You're right, Morrison said grimly. Someone does need to be held accountable. Blake, you're under arrest for attempted murder and abuse of authority. The crowd gasped as Morrison moved to arrest the corrupt judge. Blake drew his gun in panic, but Jake was faster, disarming him before he could fire a shot. Cornelius Whitmore, Morrison continued, you're under arrest for filing false charges and inciting a lynch mob. As Blake and Whitmore were led away in handcuffs, Timothy looked up at Jake with tears of gratitude in his green eyes. Mr. Jake, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life. Jake put a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. Timothy, you don't need to thank me. Any decent person would have done the same thing. But not everyone would have had the courage to stand up to a mob, Sheriff Morrison observed. Jake, you showed real backbone today. Sheriff, Jake said thoughtfully. This boy needs more than just to be cleared of false charges. He needs a home, a family, a chance to build a decent life. Timothy looked up hopefully. Are you saying? I'm saying that I've got a ranch that could use an extra hand, Jake replied with a smile. It's hard work, but it's honest work, and you'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day. What do you say? Timothy's face lit up with joy and disbelief. You'd really take me in, give me a job and a home. More than that, son. Jake said gently, I'd give you a family. I lost my own boy to fever 10 years ago, and my wife passed on 5 years back. That ranch gets mighty lonely for an old man by himself. Mary Sullivan wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the exchange. That's the most beautiful thing I've seen in years, she said softly. Sheriff Morrison clapped Jake on the shoulder. Jake Harrison, you're a good man. Timothy, You're lucky to have found someone like him." As the sun finally set over Tombstone Creek, Timothy Walsh was no longer a terrified orphan facing execution for a crime he didn't commit. Instead, he was a young man with a future, a family, and the knowledge that there were still good people in the world willing to fight for justice. "Jake," Timothy said as they prepared to leave town, "I promise I'll work harder than anyone. I'll make you proud to have taken me in." "Son," Jake replied with a warm smile, "you already have." Subscribe to our channel to see the heartwarming conclusion. How will Timothy adapt to life on Jake's ranch? What challenges will they face as they build their new family together? Don't miss the final chapter that shows how a moment of courage can change two lives forever. 1 year had passed since that terrible day when Timothy Walsh had stood on the gallows, with a rope round his neck, and the transformation in both his life and Jake Harrison's had been nothing short of miraculous. The boy who had once been a frightened, homeless orphan was now a confident young man who could rope a steer, break a horse, and manage the day-to-day operations of a successful cattle ranch. But more importantly, he had become the son that Jake had lost and the father that Timothy had never really known. "Jake," Timothy called out one crisp autumn morning as he rode up to the ranch house at full gallop, his face bright with excitement. "We've got visitors coming up the road. Looks like Sheriff Morrison and a whole bunch of people." Jake emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work shirt as he watched the approaching group. Along with Sheriff Morrison, he could see several familiar faces from Tombstone Creek, including Mary Sullivan from the hotel and Dr. Matthews, the town physician. "Wonder what brings them all the way out here," Jake mused as Timothy dismounted and joined him on the porch. Sheriff Morrison dismounted first, his weathered face creased with a smile that suggested good news. "Jake, Timothy, good to see you. Both looking so well." "Sheriff," Jake replied with a nod. "What brings you and half the town to our little spread?" "Official business," Morrison said with a grin, "and some personal business too." "Timothy, how would you feel about becoming an official citizen of Arizona Territory?" Timothy's eyes widened with surprise. "What do you mean?" "Sheriff," Dr. Matthews stepped forward, carrying an official-looking document. "Son, we've been working with the territorial government to arrange for your legal adoption by Jake Harrison. All the paperwork has been approved, and if you're willing, you can officially become Timothy Harrison." Timothy looked at Jake with tears of joy threatening to spill from his green eyes. "You want to adopt me, make it official and legal." Jake's own voice was thick with emotion as he replied, "Timothy, you've been my son in every way that matters for a year now. This just makes it official so nobody can ever question your place in this family." "But there's more," Mary Sullivan said, stepping forward with her own news. "The territorial legislature has voted to award both of you medals for courage and civic service. Your actions that day exposed corruption that went far beyond just Judge Blake and Cornelius Whitmore." Sheriff Morrison nodded grimly. "The investigation that followed your case uncovered a whole network of crooked officials and businessmen who were using false accusations and rushed trials to eliminate people. Who got in their way? Your courage to stand up to that mob saved more lives than just Timothy's." "What happened to Blake and Whitmore?" Timothy asked. "Blake got 10 years in territorial prison for abuse of authority and attempted murder," Morrison replied with satisfaction. "Whitmore got 5 years for filing false charges and inciting violence. They're both where they belong." As the official ceremonies concluded and the visitors began to head back to town, Timothy and Jake found themselves alone on the porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "Jake," Timothy said quietly, "I've been thinking about that day a lot lately." "What about it, son?" "About how close I came to dying and how you risked everything to save me. I know I've thanked you before, but I don't think I ever really understood the full extent of what you did." Jake was quiet for a moment, remembering the terror and determination he had felt watching an innocent boy face execution. "Timothy, I've been thinking about that day too, and you know what I've realized?" "What?" "That you saved me just as much as I saved you. Before that day, I was just a lonely old man going through the motions of living. But watching you face death with such courage and dignity, seeing the injustice of what was happening to you, It reminded me what it meant to fight for something that really mattered. Timothy leaned against his adoptive father's shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the past year. We saved each other then. We did indeed, Jake agreed. And we've been saving each other every day since. As they sat together in comfortable silence, both of them reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. Timothy had grown from a terrified boy into a young man of character and strength, while Jake had rediscovered his capacity for love and fatherhood. "Jake," Timothy said suddenly, "I want to tell you something important." "What's that, son?" "When I was standing on those gallows with that rope around my neck, I prayed for a miracle. I asked God to send someone who would care enough to help me, even though I was just a nobody orphan with nothing to offer." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "And what do you think now?" "I think God answered my prayer in ways I never could have imagined. He didn't just send someone to save my life. He sent someone to give me a life worth living." 5 years later, the Harrison Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in Arizona territory, known not just for its cattle and horses, but for its role in promoting justice and fairness throughout the region. Timothy, now 19, had grown into a man that Jake was proud to call his son. But their greatest source of pride wasn't their material success. It was the knowledge that they had used their experience to help other young people who found themselves in desperate circumstances. The Harrison Ranch had become an unofficial sanctuary for orphaned and abandoned children, and Timothy had become a mentor to dozens of young people who needed guidance and hope. "You know what the best part is?" Timothy said one evening as they watched a group of recently rescued children playing in the ranch yard. "What's that?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Every time we help one of these kids, it's like that day at the gallows is redeemed a little bit more. Something that was meant to destroy an innocent life becomes the foundation for saving other innocent lives." Jake nodded, watching a 10-year-old boy who reminded him of Timothy at that age, learning to care for a gentle mare. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become, Timothy, and your father too, if he could see you now." "I had good teachers," Timothy replied with a smile. "Not just you, but all the people who stood up for justice that day. Sheriff Morrison, Mary Sullivan, even the members of that crowd who eventually came around to doing the right thing." "Speaking of Sheriff Morrison," Jake said with a grin, "did you see his letter about that situation up in Flagstaff?" Timothy's eyes lit up with interest. "You mean the case with the 3 orphan brothers who were falsely accused of horse theft?" "That's the one. Morrison wants to know if we'd be willing to take them and if he can get the charges dropped." "Of course we would," Timothy said without hesitation. "This ranch exists to give kids like that a second chance, just like you gave me." As the stars came out over the Arizona desert, Jake and Timothy continued their evening routine of planning for the future and reflecting on the past. The gallows where Timothy had nearly died had long since been torn down, but the lessons learned that day continued to shape their lives and the lives of everyone they touched. "Jake," Timothy said as they prepared to head inside, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering a possibility too terrible to contemplate for long. "I try not to think about that, son. What matters is that I was there, and I had the courage to do what was right, and I had the luck to be saved by the best man in Arizona territory," Timothy added with deep affection. "No," Jake corrected gently. "You had the strength to survive until help arrived, and the wisdom to recognize that help when it came. You were never just a victim, Timothy. You were always a survivor." Years later, when people told the story of Timothy Harrison and Jake Harrison, they would focus on different aspects: the dramatic rescue from the gallows, the corruption exposed, the ranch that became a sanctuary for lost children. But for Timothy and Jake themselves, the most important part of their story was simpler: to people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to heal the wounds of the past and build something beautiful for the future. The rope that had once threatened to end Timothy's life had been cut away and burned, but the bonds of love and family that had grown from that terrible day would last forever. In saving Timothy from an unjust death, Jake had discovered that the greatest justice comes not from punishment, but from the choice to protect and nurture life, especially the lives of those who have no one else to stand up for them. subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from the American frontier. This incredible tale of Timothy and Jake proves that courage is contagious, and that one person's willingness to stand up for justice can change not just individual lives, but entire communities. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join us for more emotional journeys that show how family is built not just through blood, but through the choice to love and protect each other against all odds. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that there are still people in this world willing to cut the ropes that bind us and set us free to become who we're meant to be.